Hello again. Now, admittedly, this particular video may not be everybody's cup of tea, but I think everybody can gain something from it. In its broadest sense, this video is about hermeneutics. How do we approach the Bible? How do we understand the Bible? And what methodologies are we going to use to help us understand what the text is attempting to convey? That's what hermeneutics is. But in the more narrow sense, this video is about eschatology. Now, our English word eschatology is actually a contraction of two Greek words, eschaton, which means last things, and logia, or words. Put them together, and it's really words about the last things. So when I say eschatology, I'm talking about those portions of Scripture where the writers or the prophets talked about things that were future to them, or at very least, the things that are going to happen when this age, this world, wraps up and we enter the age to come. So that's eschatology. Now, when it comes to eschatology, there are really two very broad camps. There's the historicist view and there's the futurist view. The difference between those two views is that the futurist will say that most of the prophecies that are apocalyptic in nature, most of those prophecies that speak of a time of trouble such as never was or ever would be again, or that speak of a man of sin, a lawless one who will be a world leader and a religious leader by his side, the false prophet, that those kinds of prophecies are still future to us. They've yet to occur. They're still forthcoming. That's, in its broadest sense, the futurist view. On the other end of the spectrum, we have the historicist view. Now, a historicist will approach those texts and say that they, to some degree, have already been accomplished. They have already happened. And there's actually a fairly broad spectrum within the historicist camp. For instance, on one end, you'll have what's called the full preterist position. Full preterism says that everything in the Bible that's predictive, everything in the Bible that's prophetic, came to its full fruition in 70 AD with the destruction of Jerusalem and the scattering of the Jews out of Jerusalem. And so they say that everything, including the return of Christ, happened, that Christ returned in a spiritual sense when he returned in judgment on Jerusalem in 70 AD. And so essentially there's really nothing left in the Bible that we are looking forward to. The time and the age in which we're now living is just going to continue until it reaches its end, and then again there are variances of thought about how that end wraps up. So that's one end, the preterist view. Now there's also a partial preterist view that says most of the stuff that's in like Matthew 24 has been wrapped up as of 70 AD, that the man of sin can be identified as Caesar, probably Caesar Nero, and that other than the return of Christ at the culmination of this age, everything else that's prophetically written in the New Testament is accomplished and wrapped up. Now, also in the historicist camp, you'll find some amillennialists. Now, amillennialism is sometimes referred to as realized eschatology. In other words, they see most of what's happened in the New Testament prophetically to be coming to its fruition right now. It's being realized. We're seeing it now. So all the language of kingdom and the language of Christ reigning from David's throne is occurring right now. It's happening in the age in which we live, and this age will be wrapped up when Christ comes back. Judgment instantaneously takes place at his return, and we enter into the age to come, with no gap in between there for a time of trouble, necessarily tribulation, or especially not 1,000 years of kingdom reign on the earth by Christ. That's amillennialism. Now, all of those ideas and groups, the amillennialist, the partial preterist, the full preterist, they're all in the historicist camp. They all say that most of what you can find in the New Testament that is prophetic has already been accomplished. And that is in contrast to the futurist view, which says that great big swaths of what is predicted in the New Testament has yet to occur and is still future to us. And so we are looking forward to the return of Christ. We anticipate, but not happily, a time of trouble such as never was or ever would be again, but that when Christ returns, he will establish his kingdom, and he will reign on earth for 1,000 years from David's throne over the collective 12 tribes of Israel, whom he will regather for that 1,000 years. That's the futurist view. So all I want to do for this video is for you to understand those two big camps, historicist and futurist. Because the text that we're going to look at today is a key text, a key proof text for pretty much every historicist I've ever encountered or ever read. They all go to this text as proof positive that the historicist view is the correct understanding and interpretation of the Bible. The text in question is Matthew 24:34. The debate revolves around what exactly Jesus meant when he said these words. This generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. That's the King James Version of it. The New American Standard Version says, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Now, when Jesus says all these things, he's referring to everything he had already described in what we call Matthew 24. Now, Matthew chapter 24 is jam-packed with prophecies of trouble coming on planet Earth. Jesus begins in Matthew 24 by predicting, you see all these things. He's referring to the temple. He says, truly I say to you, there won't be one stone left upon another that will not be thrown down. So Matthew 24 begins with the prediction of the destruction of the temple at Jerusalem. But Jesus doesn't leave it there. He then predicts things like, don't let anyone lead you astray, because many will come and say, I am Christ. But don't follow them. In verse 6 he says, you'll hear about wars, rumors of war. See that you're not alarmed, for these must take place. But the end is not yet, for nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there are going to be famines and earthquakes in various places. And all these things are but the beginning of birth pangs. And then he goes on from there to describe a time of trouble such as never was or ever will be again. But the trouble is concentrated on Jerusalem and on the residents of that area of the world. And so he then hearkens back to Daniel and says, and when you see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, as described by Daniel, then flee. And he describes what that flight is going to be like, and says it's so sudden that if you're on the rooftop, don't go down and get a cloak. If you're out in the field, just take off. Don't return home. And it's going to be hard on pregnant women, and pray that your flight is not going to be on the Sabbath. And so there is this time of trouble coming, just a horrific time of trouble such as never was or ever would be again, such that Jesus says if those days were not shortened, no flesh would survive. And so for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. Now, all those things have to come to their fruition by the culmination of this generation. So, if by using the phrase this generation, Jesus meant the people who were his contemporaries on the planet at that moment, if by the phrase this generation, Jesus meant everybody who's alive right now while I'm speaking, well then you just do a little bit of simple math. A generation in the Bible is typically assumed to be 40 years, more or less. So if he's speaking in the early 30s AD and you add 40 years, that takes you into the early 70s AD, and that takes you right to the time of the destruction of the temple at Jerusalem in 70 AD. And so if everything that Jesus described in Matthew 24 has to come to its fruition in that 40-year period, and has to be all wrapped up within that 40 years, well, then the historicist view is inarguable. The historicist view wins, and anybody who holds to a futurist view is just wrong. They're contradicting the plain words of Jesus, because Jesus plainly and obviously said that all these things need to be wrapped up within 40 years, in the time of this generation. And that is the historicist view. But there's another understanding of that phrase, and that's what this video is about. Have you ever heard the word anachronism or anachronistic? What that means is to place a person or an object or a word in its wrong chronology, in its wrong time frame. I'll give you a quick example. If you're watching a Hollywood movie about, say, cowboys and Indians, and on the horizon you see an airplane fly by, well, that would be an anachronism. That airplane is in the wrong time frame. Well, far too often when people are reading the Bible and interpreting the Bible, they subject themselves to a fair bit of anachronistic reading. In other words, they assume that the words on the page mean what the words mean right now, here, today. Now, 2,000 years have passed since the original New Testament authors sat down and wrote their texts. And so to really understand any particular text, we have to look at its historic meaning, its historic grammar, and the historic definitions of the particular Greek words. And then, to make things even more complicated, we also have to look at the particular English words that English translators used when translating those Greek words, because even our English words have changed meaning over time. For instance, if you're reading the King James Bible and you come across 2 Thessalonians 2:7, it says, "For the mystery of iniquity doth already work, only he who now letteth will let until he is taken out of the way." Now, if you're reading that from a 21st century mindset, you're going to think that the word let means to allow. He that allows will allow until he's taken out of the way. But in 1611, when the King James writers were interpreting 2 Thessalonians, what they actually were saying was, he that now hinders or restrains, because the Old English word let meant exactly that, to restrain something. In fact, if you've ever watched a tennis match, in tennis, if a ball is struck by the net and held back, that's called a let ball. It's a restrained ball. But the vast majority of the time when you see the word let in our modern English, it means to allow something. So if you read the word let through that modern framework, then you're going to get confused, because you're going to think that what Paul wrote was, he that allows will allow, when in fact what Paul said is, he that restrains will restrain. He wrote it 2,000 years ago. In 1611, the King James translators used a perfectly good word and said, he that now lets, which meant restrain. But now another 400 years have passed, and the word let has changed its meaning through usage. Whenever you pick up a modern dictionary, understand that a dictionary is simply telling you the most common meaning of a word and how it is commonly used. And dictionaries change over time. The English language is an amalgam of various different languages, from Latin and Greek to French and German, and all the different folks who have come to America have brought their terminology with them, and all of that terminology has worked its way into our melting pot of English language. And of course, new words are being invented all the time. 20 years ago, nobody was talking about the internet, and nobody was talking about bits and bytes or Facebooking, because language is fluid. Language changes. So if we're really going to understand what New Testament writers wrote and understand their meaning, we have to take the time to do the detective work, the investigation, into not only what the original Greek word was and what that Greek word meant, but also how that word has been translated into the English language over time. So that's now what we're going to engage in, a little bit of investigative word study. Let's start with the Greek word that is translated generation in most of our English translations. The Greek word is genea. It is, as you can see behind me, it is Genea, and if you simply put logia at the end of it, if you combine genea with logia, the same way that we earlier combined eschaton with logia and got eschatology, you put them together and you get genealogy. You'll notice that it moved straight into the English language, essentially unchanged. Now, a genealogy is a series of people of common descent. And so, when you see the genealogy of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew or in the Gospel of Luke, it is described as these are the generations of Jesus, because it's that same Greek root. It means these are the people from which Jesus came. This is his heritage. This is also his nationality. This is his tribal affiliation. The word genea means all those things, but it essentially means this. The root, G-E-N, we might pronounce it gen in modern English, but that gen root denotes produce. So it's resulted in English words like Genesis, or genre, or generation, or genus. All those words have that G-E-N root because it has to do with producing offspring, moving from generation to generation, and so it designates people of a particular descent. Now, in Thayer's Greek-English lexicon of the New Testament, it provides these definitions for the word genea. Number one, a begetting, a birth, nativity. Number two, that which has been begotten, men of the same stock, or a family. Then 2a, the several ranks of natural descent, the successive members of a genealogy. And 2b, metaphorically, a race of men very like each other in endowments, pursuits, and character. And then under 2b1, Thayer's adds, especially in a bad sense, like a perverse nation or a perverse generation. Number 3, the whole multitude of men living at the same time, used especially of the Jewish race living at one and the same period. And number 4, an age, i.e. the time ordinarily occupied by each successive generation, typically a space of 30 to 33 years. Now likewise, Strong's Greek Dictionary of the New Testament reads, it's number 1074 for those of you who like Strong's numbers, it reads, a generation, by implication, an age, a period of persons, age, generation, nation, time. Notice that one of the primary definitions of genea is a group of people of common descent, and it also denotes a nation of people. Now that's important, because if we read the Bible anachronistically, then every time we see the word generation, we're going to assume that it means people who are alive on the planet concurrent with each other at any given moment. But that's not the primary way that the word genea was used in the Greek language. When Jesus used the word genea, he did not necessarily have to mean everybody alive right now as I'm speaking. He could very well have been speaking of people of a common descent, people who were part of a nation of people. And that's the way I believe it is being understood. Now, let's look at word usage for just a moment. In the King James Version, Genea is translated generation 37 times. Time, twice. Age, twice. And nation, only once. But when the King James was translated, a people of a common descent was one of the listed meanings of the English word generation. Even though our modern Merriam-Webster dictionary does not list this as a possible meaning, the 1908 Webster Dictionary does provide this definition: a race, a kind, family, breed, or stock. And the Random House College Dictionary of 1968 includes the offspring of a certain parent or couple considered as a step in natural descent. So, despite the fact that most modern folk will read the word generation and think that it means people of a particular time frame, even 100 years ago, in our English language, the word generation was understood to be a reference to people of a common descent, people who had the same national characteristics, people who were of the same tribe or the same clan. Those people were of a particular generation. So word usage in the English has changed, and the way we understand the word generation today is not the way that the word generation was understood by even previous generations of Americans. The word has changed usage in the last 100 years. But the bigger question is, when the King James translators were translating the book of Matthew into English and using Old English terminology, what did they think the word generation meant? The best way to understand the Old English and the definitions that were in use and in play at the time that the King James Version was being written is to also look at other documents that were being written around the same time. It's the same way that we do with the Greek language. We don't just look at the Bible to understand first century Greek or Koine Greek. We look at all kinds of other documents that were written using that same language so that we can get a better grasp of the depth and the breadth with which a particular word was used. Well, back in the 1600s, when the King James Version was being written and the Old English was in common use, there was also, fortunately, a fellow named William Shakespeare writing some plays. And Shakespeare actually employed the word generation in one of his plays, and that's really, really helpful. This is a play, one of his lesser-known plays, called The Life of Timon of Athens. And in Act 1, Scene 1, we hear a conversation between this fellow Timon and a not at all nice fellow named Epaminondas. And Epaminondas has walked into a room where there are several other people, and he has been insulting these people for their various trades and their work. As soon as he enters, the jeweler says, "We'll bear with your lordship," and the merchant says he'll spare none, speaking of Epaminondas and his generally disagreeable character. Timon then greets him and says, "Good morrow to thee, gentle Epaminondas." Epaminondas replies, "Till I be gentle, stay thou for thy good morrow, when thou art Timon's dog and these knaves honest." So Timon says, "Why dost thou call them knaves? Thou knowest them not." And Epaminondas says, "Are they not Athenians?" Timon says, "Yes." And he says, "Then I repent not." The jeweler asks, "You know me, Epaminondas?" Epaminondas says, "Thou knowest I do. I called thee by thy name." Timon says, "Thou art proud, Epaminondas." Epaminondas replies, "Of nothing so much as that I am not like Timon." Timon says, "Whither art thou going?" And Epaminondas says, "To knock out an honest Athenian's brains." Timon says, "That's a deed thou'lt die for." Epaminondas says, "Right. if doing nothing be death by the law. Timon, how likest thou this picture, Epamantus? And Epamantus says, the best for the innocents. Wrought he not well that painted it? Timon asks. And Epamantus says, he wrought better that made the painter, and yet he's but a filthy piece of work. So he's just insulted the painter's father, and perhaps his mother. So the painter replies, you are a dog. And Epamantus says, thy mother's of my generation. What's she, if I be a dog? Now that's really, really interesting. Because Epamantus could not have possibly meant, your mother is of the same time frame as me. Your mother is living on the planet as the same time as me, and so if I'm a dog, what is she? No, he's talking about nationality. He's talking about people of a particular heritage, like the Athenians he's been insulting. And so when the painter says to Epamantus, you are a dog, his reply is, well, your mother's of my generation. She's of my same people group. We have the same common descent, and so if I'm a dog, what is she? And so the word generation, as used by Shakespeare, does not mean people who live at the same time and are concurrent on the planet in the exact same chronology. The word generation in Shakespearean usage means people of a common descent, people of a common heritage. Now that's important to know, because that means that when the New Testament King James translators were dealing with the Greek word genea, and they understood that the Greek word genea had this wide berth, where it could mean people of a particular time, but it could also mean a nation or a people group or people of a common heritage or descent, people of a common genealogy. Knowing that, they chose quite rightly the English word generation as a translation, because the English word generation also had that particular meaning. So it was a perfectly good translation. Unfortunately, as I've said, what's happened over time is that even up until 100 years ago, we understood the word generation to mean all those various things. But in the last 100 years, because dictionaries change according to word usage, that particular definition has fallen out of our more modern contemporary dictionaries until we think that the word generation only means and always means and can only mean people who live at the same time. But in fact, the word genea and the English word generation both have the historic meaning of people of a common ancestry, people of a common genealogy, or a particular nationality, or a particular characteristic that is connected by their genetics. And that's important to remember when we read Matthew 24:34. Now, here's the rub, a little Shakespearean humor there. Most of our modern translations, when they translate the word genea, continue to use the modern word generation as the translation. And as I said, it's a good translation, but unfortunately, our contemporary anachronistic understanding of what the word generation means has become too narrow to help us really understand what the Bible writers meant. As a consequence, some more recent translations of the Bible have chosen to expand on the word generation so that we have a greater understanding of it. For instance, Kenneth Woost, in his expanded translation of the New Testament, renders Matthew 24:34 as saying, "Assuredly I am saying to you, this nation shall by no means pass away until all these things take place." Similarly, in the New Testament in today's language, came out in 1964, William F. Beck rendered it this way, "I tell you the truth, these people will not pass away until all these things happen." So when we read the New Testament, it's important that we keep in mind that the word generation has not always meant what we assume it means today. In fact, offspring, nation, people of a common descent. These are all perfectly acceptable translations of the word genea. And sometimes the meaning is obvious just from the context. For instance, Luke 16:8 says, "And the Lord commended the unjust steward because he had done wisely, for the children of this world are in their generation wiser than the children of light." So was Jesus saying that the children of this world were only wise in that particular place and time? Or was he saying that they are wiser in their dealings with each other? And given the parable that was just presented, it's much more likely that Jesus was talking about the interaction of worldly people among themselves as compared to the children of light and how they conduct themselves. And so that's how the NASB understood Jesus' words. And they rendered it, "And his master praised the unrighteous manager because he had acted shrewdly, for the sons of this age are more shrewd in relation to their own kind," genea, "than the sons of light." So in fact, Jesus was making a contrast between the children of this world and the children of light. These people have a common characteristic. These people have a common characteristic. And he used the word genea in order to describe that fact. And it is the context that helps us understand which of the various meanings of genea is the appropriate understanding. That's why it's so important to do word study, look at word usage, look at the historic grammatical usage of the word, look at how it's used in the Greek language, and then look at how it's used in the different time frames during which translations were being translated. Because the word genea 2,000 years ago had a meaning that was very similar to what generation meant in the 1600s. And so they were, in fact, very cooperative words. But in the last 100 years, the word generation has changed its meaning, and so some of the newer translations have very purposefully avoided using the word generation there in order to avoid the confusion that comes from the anachronistic reading. So with all that in mind, exactly what does Matthew 24:34 mean? Well, if you take it all into consideration, Jesus is not saying anything in Matthew 24:34 that isn't consistent with what the prophets have always said about national Israel. The prophets of Israel speak with a unified voice. And even though they all say that Israel has rebelled against God and clearly broken his law and his commandments and his ordinances, and God has driven them out of their land by the time Jesus is walking on the planet, Israel has a long, rich history of falling under waves of God's punishment and dispersions because of their lack of faithfulness to God and to his word. But just as the prophets all say that Israel is guilty and going to fall under God's punishment, they all also say that God is going to restore them, that God is going to unite them, that God is going to gather all 12 tribes and bring them back to the land that was promised to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. That is the consistent testimony of the Old Testament prophets. And Jesus isn't saying anything different than that. Let me give you an example. Jeremiah 31 is the most obvious example. In Jeremiah 31, we find the promise of the new covenant. But the audience that is being written to, the audience that Jeremiah is speaking to, is very, very plain and clear. Jeremiah 31:27, "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will sow the house of Israel and the house of Judah with the seed of man and with the seed of beast." As this is being written, Israel and Judah are in a terrible state. They're under the Babylonian captivity, and that's not the last of the captivities they're going to go through. They're going to be scattered. They're going to be driven out of their land, and they're going to be occasionally regathered, at least the southern tribes. Judah is going to be regathered back into their land during the time that Jesus is walking and talking in Jerusalem. He's among the Jews, so they're back in their land, and then as I've mentioned, as of 70 AD, and the fall of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, and even the southern tribes are scattered yet again. But that's not the end of the story. Jeremiah, knowing all that, says the days are coming when God will sow the house of Israel, northern tribes, and the house of Judah, southern tribes, with the seed of man and the seed of beast, despite their captivity. And it shall come to pass that as I have watched over them to pluck them up and to break them down, to overthrow, to destroy, and to bring harm, so I will watch over them to build and to plant, says the Lord. In those days they shall no longer say, the fathers have eaten sour grapes, and the children's teeth are set on edge, but everyone shall die for his own sin. Each man who eats sour grapes, his teeth will be set on edge. Behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel, northern tribes, and with the house of Judah, southern tribes. Not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day that I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. Well, now we know exactly who he's talking about, the 12 tribes that he brought out of the land of Egypt. And then he's very plain. My covenant that they broke, though I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. So there's no question Israel broke the first covenant, the Sinai covenant. And since that covenant is no longer capable of restoring or saving Israel, God is going to establish a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. And it won't be like that first covenant that he made with them at Mount Sinai. But this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel in those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. Now, that's the prophetic response to Israel's rebellion. The prophets all say this. They all agree that no matter what, God is going to return to Israel, and they are going to return to him. Well, this chapter wraps up with this grand declaration. Thus says the Lord, who gives the sun for light by day, and the fixed order of the moon and the stars for light by night, who stirs up the sea so that its waves roar. The Lord of hosts is his name. This is what he says. If this fixed order, waves, seas, sun, stars, the universe, if this fixed order departs from before me, declares the Lord, then shall the offspring of Israel cease from being a nation before me forever. Thus says the Lord, if the heavens above can be measured and the foundations of the earth below can be explored, that's hyperbole. He's saying it can't be. Nobody could ever measure the heavens above or the earth below. No man has that capability, despite all of our science and our telescopes and everything. We still have not explored every corner and measured every corner of the universe. And so he says, if the heavens above can be measured and the foundations of the earth below can be explored, then I will cast off all the offspring of Israel for all that they've done, declares the Lord. And that is exactly what Jesus was getting at in Matthew 24:34. He wasn't saying anything different than what the Old Testament prophets have always said. Think about it from the perspective of the New Testament first century Jewish listeners to whom Jesus was speaking in Matthew 24. Not only has he just told them that their temple is going to be destroyed, but then he says, see that no one leads you astray. Many are going to come in my name and say that I am Christ, and they're going to lead many astray. You're going to hear about wars and rumors of war. Don't be alarmed. These things have to take place. You see, he's explaining to them that the world is going to get progressively worse, but don't be afraid. Don't be alarmed. These are just the birth pangs of what's to come. And so he says nation's going to rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There's going to be famines and earthquakes in various places. And again, these things are all the beginning of birth pangs. And they're going to deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death. And you're going to be hated by all nations for my name's sake. Well, that's just really frightening. That's just really scary. And so the natural question is going to be, well, then are we going to be wiped out? Is that going to be the end for us? And actually quite different, quite opposite from what the historicist would say. they would end up saying, well, yes, the answer is basically yes. Jesus is saying that as of 70 AD, when the temple is torn down and you're all scattered, that's the end of national Israel. And God is going to turn his attention to the church exclusively from that point forward. But that's quite the opposite of what Jesus was actually saying in Matthew 24:34. Instead, he was assuring them that all these things were going to take place, which includes all the bad stuff and the time of tribulation and the abomination of desolation. All of that was going to take place, including the return of the Son of Man. But this Genea, this people group, this generation, will not pass till all these things are fulfilled. He's saying the same thing Jeremiah said in Jeremiah 31. That no matter what happens, as long as there is sun and moon and stars and waves roaring on the beaches, God will never abandon national Israel. They will always be a nation before him. Jesus just said it as this people of common descent, this common people group, this nation will not pass till all these things have been fulfilled. And that makes complete sense because, after all, Jesus also grabbed a hold of that prophecy that someday they were going to look on him whom they had pierced. And that is absolutely impossible unless they're there and aware and alive when he returns. There has to be people who are of that common descent that pierced him in order to view him when he returns. And listen, in the very big picture, the futurist view says that since Jesus said to his 12 apostles that in the regeneration they would sit on 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel, well then there must actually be 12 tribes of Israel to judge. When the New Jerusalem comes down, it's built on the foundations of the 12 apostles, but there are 12 gates that have the 12 names of the 12 tribes of Israel. There is this continuity, this perpetuity to the 12 tribes of Israel. The northern tribes, the southern tribes, the house of Israel, the house of Judah. And they've been promised by Jeremiah that they are never going to cease to be a nation before God. They are promised by all the Old Testament prophets that they're going to be regathered. And Jesus knows all those prophecies, and he is not contradicting those prophecies. He is, in fact, validating those prophecies and assuring the people who are listening to him that this generation, this Genea, this people group, these Israelites, will not pass until all these things have come to their complete fruition. The Bible is very consistent with itself. It says the same thing all the way through. And that's why I read Matthew 24:34 the way that I do. Now, someone will say, you read it that way because you're a futurist. And I would reply, no, I'm a futurist because that's what the text says. And when I put all the various elements of the text together, I simply cannot conclude that the historicist view is the proper view. Whether it's Old Testament, whether it's New Testament, whether it's the Gospels, whether it's the Pauline epistles, whether it's the book of Revelation, they all speak consistently of the continuity of Israel. And Jesus wasn't saying anything other than that in Matthew 24:34. So I hope that helps. Let me just add this one last point. If you're going to use a particular passage or a particular word as bedrock foundation for your position, then it's really, really important that you make sure that the word you're using means what you think it means. Because if there's any possibility that it has a different potential meaning and that this other potential meaning does fit very well with the immediate context and the larger context and the historic context, well then it's very hard for you to say this word means this and it can only mean this, and therefore I'm going to rest my position on this word. So very frequently I have heard historicists, some who have argued against the futurist view, and they always seem to go to Matthew 24:34, and they always go to the phrase, this generation. And if you're going to make that argument and make it work, then you have to be 100% certain that the phrase, this generation, means what you think it means. And what I hope I've proven in this video is that there is another very valid understanding of that phrase. And that alternate understanding undermines that bedrock core foundation that the historicist likes to rest on. Anyway, I hope that helped a bit. And if you hung with this all the way through to the end, I hope that you were benefited in some way from it. Let the emails and the comments begin.